Today, monetary policy is seen as the dominant policy lever for managing the economy, and the bank is the widely respected custodian and operator of that lever. But it was not always thus. For much of the 1960s and 70s, monetary policy was generally seen as supplementary to fiscal policy, and the bank as being subservient to Canberra, not only to the Treasurer but also to the Treasury. But monetary policy did have its moments in those early days. I joined the public service in January 1961, some months after the so-called credit squeeze package of 1960. That package actually included some fiscal measures as well as credit measures, and was implemented to restrain spending, which at the time was pushing up inflation and eating into Australia's external reserves. The tightening proved excessive. Unemployment more than doubled from 1.6% in 1960 to 2.6% in 1961, and but for Jim Killen eventually retaining his seat, Menzies would have lost office at the December 1961 election. For me, this was an early demonstration of the potency of monetary policy, even in a regulated environment, and of the costliness of policy miscalculations. Despite that poor start, though, the 1960s proved a generally good decade for the Australian economy. During this period, the Bretton Woods system of pegged exchange rates helped to keep a reasonable check on inflation. But life really started to become more difficult for policymakers in the 1970s and into the 1980s, and policymakers didn't cope all that well with the changes. Those changes included the end of the Bretton Woods system in the early 1970s, rapid monetary expansion in the US to fund the Vietnam War and other domestic programs, several oil price shocks, and a variety of other policy miscalculations. Inflation remained a problem throughout this period, with bouts of recession, stop-go, and stagflation. The growth in non-bank activities, which were outside the reach of the central bank's regulatory system of controls, further complicated monetary policy. Around the mid-1980s, though, the bank was in a position to adopt a market-based policy system centred as now on the cash rate. By this time, yields on Treasury notes and bonds were determined in the marketplace, the Australian dollar had been floated, and bank interest rates deregulated. These changes were part of an ongoing deregulation process kicked along by the Campbell and Martin committees, which also saw additional banking licences awarded to 16 foreign banks in the mid-1980s, as well as to some local financial institutions around the time. In essence, the time had come to move to a market-based system. The old regulatory system could not hack it in the new world of financial market deregulation and globalisation. These changes occurred around the same time that confidence in the efficacy of fiscal policy was waning, and this was on the back of a series of ongoing budget deficits, and concerns about inflation were rising. And these developments together helped to swing the spotlight for demand management onto monetary policy. Unfortunately, the new system did not get off to a particularly auspicious start, partly reflecting the presence of additional banks and fierce competition for market share. Bank lending took off in the second half of the 80s, fueling a bubble in property prices in 1988 and 1989. Interest rates were raised during this period to combat that development, but with little apparent effect, while bullish sentiment and rises in property prices continued to outpace the rises in interest rates. But the bubble was burst by cash rates of 17 to 18%, ushering in the short but relatively sharp recession of 1990-1991. From that time until the recent global disturbances, Australia recorded around 17 consecutive years of robust economic growth, with inflation on average around the bank's target range. Sound monetary policies contributed significantly to this outcome, lifting the profile and the status of the Reserve Bank in the process. Today's market-based monetary policy is largely underwritten by the decision to float the Australian dollar in 1983 and by the adoption of a flexible inflation target in the early 1990s. Both were pragmatic responses to evolving situations. They were not ideologically driven. The same can be said of the practice initiated in January 1990 of announcing board decisions to change interest rates, to change the cash rate, and to give some reasons for the changes, rather than, as had previously been the case, leaving the market to divine what was going on by examining the bank's market operations. As for the bank's independence, this was asserted and acquired pragmatically. It was not simply a matter of waking up and deciding to front up to the Treasury one day and say, Paul, from tomorrow the bank alone will call all the shots on interest rates. This would not have been a smart approach, even if the Treasurer was other than Paul Keating. But in practice, the bank did get to that position fairly quickly, and the bank's independence has been formally acknowledged in subsequent exchanges of letters between treasurers and governors. But it was a careful and pragmatic journey, assisted on its way by judgment calls by the bank on interest rate changes, which were good enough to withstand public and market scrutiny. The upheavals in financial markets over the past couple of years are a further reminder of how different those markets are from the more straightforward markets for goods and services that I mentioned earlier. Those financial markets are about massive investments and speculations for profit, not consumption. They are more susceptible to human emotions like greed and panic than the more straightforward markets. Many products are complex and lack transparency. Market players are heavily leveraged with, in this most recent case, their risk appetites whetted by years of easy money, especially in the United States. That recent experience, which is still with us, underscores, in a world of linked financial markets, the vulnerability of others to under-regulation of those markets in a country as prominent as the United States. And I think it can be said fairly that this under-regulation in the United States and in some European countries reflected a deliberate light touch approach to regulation based on a belief that market forces would deliver the necessary checks and balances. If nothing else, the GFC should have demonstrated emphatically that market forces alone cannot be relied upon to avoid damaging swings in these markets.